First, thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak on these issues, and I'll just get right into it with time being short. The value-based outcome review is essentially a reiteration of reports we've seen in the past, so-called opportunities and efficiencies for managing finances and operations. Like many before it, it failed to address the problems of long-term predictable and sustainable funding. In fact, the analysis completely leaves out consideration of core funding sources like flow-through from other orders of government, deeming non-material because the city has no control over it. But funding from other orders of government directly impact the levels and staffing. The report itself was paid for by the province, which is pushing a service and cost-cutting agenda. The provincial funding goes directly to services like childcare, which will be significantly impacted by recommendations in the report. These funding sources should be considered as a key source of any value dollar strategy, and the city should be looking at funding tools before cutting services. The report does acknowledge a historical reliance on efficiencies, which we know as cuts to programs and staff, to fund growth and budget holes. And Local 79 agrees the efficiencies can no longer be used to balance budget holes created by poor long-term growth and funding planning. So once again, how we get there has significant implications. The most disturbing recommendations in the report is to offload childcare. The premise of this recommendation is that paying less for what is typically women's labor is okay, and that this will somehow solve the waitlist problem. Peel Region is used as an example of success, but Peel just announced it will face a waitlist for the first time since offloading childcare because of recently announced provincial funding cuts. Clearly, offloading childcare did not solve Peel's waitlist problem. Now Toronto wants to dump the provincial childcare funding problems onto the sector. Offloading childcare to the sector to do more with less is unacceptable. The childcare centre represents a small percentage of the overall sector, but have a huge percentage of impact across the sector. For wages for women, standards of work and quality. Does the city want to absolve themselves of this sort of standard? I find it disturbing that childcare is what we look at every single time the city looks for service cuts. The Auditor General's report already made this recommendation, and the city has a childcare growth strategy it has committed to. No decisions should be made until the outstanding divisional reports come out this year. There are also huge labor implications. Childcare workers at no time was labor or the public consulted on such proposals, which could end up costing the city more to implement. Means testing of universal programs is another recommendation. The city already tried versions of this years ago. They started charging program fees at some community centres and in priority neighbourhoods where the need was great. It didn't work. People couldn't pay, enrollment went down, and the city ultimately reversed the fee increases. Means testing is a cutback proposed in the name of reducing budget deficits, but it is unfair and adds more bureaucratic cost to administer. It also creates a proof of poverty scenario that the city should not support in principle, and it goes against its own poverty reduction strategy. The report also talks about workforce optimization, rostering of staff, and automating work. The city wants us to believe that the people are to blame for their budget problems, but as long as we've had public services, we'll need to deliver these services. In other reports, we have seen similar catchphrases which boil down to one thing: less programs and services for fewer staff to deliver. It's misleading to suggest we can get rid of people, reduce staffing, and not affect services at community and child care centres, shelters, and long-term care homes. Yet, these human services that stand to be the most deeply impacted by proposals in this report were left out of the funding analysis.
I'll have to ask you to reach a conclusion shortly. We're past the 5 minutes.
Thank you. In conclusion, this report will move towards a clear lack of public accountability by giving the city justification to make decisions using pro-business, private sector approach. The city is not private. It is a public entity owned by the public and accountable to the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions, Councillor Holladay?
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you for speaking to us. You talked about childcare, and there's a section in the report about it. But I raised some questions earlier, and I'm not sure you're here for them, but there's some discussion in the report about how to fund these sorts of things. Do you have a position on how the city would pay for increased childcare? And as we heard from the previous speaker, investments in wages and in the system?
I would ask if my colleague could provide some information on that.
Thanks, Councillor and Dave. If you're asking specifically about how to orient different income to different services, I think the city has a suite of revenue tools that are available to it that have been routinely discussed at council, and perhaps one of those could be looked at to continue funding for different services that are deemed higher as a threshold.
Could you elaborate a bit more? So you're not suggesting property tax, but something else?
Property tax is one of the suite of revenue tools that's available to the city in the City of Toronto Act.
Okay, is there anything else that you would suggest as property tax?
Again, I mean, I think the union has been quite clear on the different suite of tools that we could do. The vehicle registration tax has been raised before. The MLTT has been baked in different parts of the budget. Again, the City of Toronto Act clearly states all of those options.
Fair enough. There's another part in the report, you can see it in and around page 29, but it doesn't matter. It's just a fundamental discussion. It talks about the capital plan, and our current capital plan. It makes the observation that we don't deliver all of it. It takes a lot of horsepower to change the money into product. Do the members have a thought on what the implication is in realizing the capital plans? We're talking about capital dollars, big projects, but how do we scale capacity to commit the output that is contemplated in this report? Or do we scale back the capital plan to 75%, as is one of the discussions in here? There's implications in that, but do you have a position on that?
I think the mayor has laid out his options clearly today for how to fund a lot of that and create, I think it's $6.6 billion in leverage to look to funding those things, which I believe would be getting close to a third of some of the projects that folks want to deliver in the city and direction has been given to. There are other measures as well. The city, for example, has a 15% debt ceiling, if you will, on it. The province's regulations state that that could be higher, so there are other options available.
Do you sense there might be an impact on the operating side, though, if we scaled up capital delivery as contemplated in the report? And then what would that mean to, let's say, the money we'd have to collect from the tax base?
To me, the report wasn't clear on the interplay between capital from current and current from capital, and I would say that that should be examined closely.
Do you think it would be material, though, to scale up from 75% to 100% of the contemplated capital delivery plan?
It would be material, but it's not contemplated without resources to it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Holladay. Are there other visiting members wanting to ask questions? If not, I can move to members of the committee, to Deputy Mayor Barlow.
Just a very quick question, because I just want to make sure that everybody understands your position clearly. On the office optimization and workforce optimization, I mean, there's lots of projects going on to give better service. I mean, I'm very familiar, for example, with the choice-based service on the waiting list, to manage the waiting list. And nobody's even thinking about removing those people, but actually focusing the work of those people and actually helping people that need it the most. You're not saying that we shouldn't look into technology, you shouldn't modernize the way that we do things. That's not what you're saying, right? I mean, you do support things like this that actually give a better service to the residents of Toronto. Is that correct? I just want to make sure that we are on the same page, because from previous conversations, I did think that you were supportive of initiatives like that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of an awkward position, too. I think everyone knows that we're in a bargaining window as well. But I would say that the union has been flexible in terms of discussion about that in the past. But certainly everything deserves a close look.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions by members of the committee? I just have a couple, if I might. First of all, I really want to just deal with what took up the bulk of your presentation, and I think it's possible a listener might have concluded that you were suggesting that the city had, in some way or in any way, shape, or form, suggested that the recommendation, which is in the Ernst Young report, that we should, have the private sector take over the city-run childcare had somehow been adopted, embraced. There'd been any intimation whatsoever that we were going to proceed with that, because you kept talking about the city doing this and that, and you would agree with me that this is a recommendation in a report written by a firm that was retained to look at possibilities, but that in no way, shape, or form have the city officials, the politicians, the mayor, anybody else indicated any intention to proceed with that. It's just there as a recommendation that somebody will take a look at, I presume. You'd agree with that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you. And I had the same question. I mean, and I think you've answered it with respect to the automation. And then I'd just like to pursue for 1 second sorry, I didn't put the thing on. The question of, how do you feel? I mean, you talked about the suite of other revenue tools, but recognizing that actually those are pretty small in number in terms of ones that are actually in reality available to us, do you feel in general, and this is the question Deputy Mayor Holliday was asking you, that property taxes are a viable source of funding for social programs?
Well, I do think that that certainly revenue could come out of taxes, whether it be property taxes is not up for me to decide. That would be up to council to consider, I would think.
Okay, but I guess the point I'm trying to make, and you were discussing it a bit with Deputy Mayor Holliday, is that we only have very limited revenues beyond property and commercial taxes. I mean, there are other revenues, so the principal place from which we get revenues to pay for anything is property taxes. And I'm just asking your view on social programs, especially broad-based social programs like childcare. Do you think, that relative to the other sources of income available to other governments is the best way or a viable way at all to pay for social programs?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, no, of course, right? And it's
Of course, yes, or?
Yeah, it's a material source of income for the city. It's the #1 source. I think the equation is for every property tax point, it's $30 million in income to the city. I guess the point that we want to leave with is that while the capital investment is critical, that the operating side also can't be just completely ignored.
Okay, fair enough. And because I think we're always having this discussion, you're aware of the fact that we're actually trying to remove the reliance on the operating side of the budget on the municipal land transfer tax because it's a volatile source of revenue, as we've seen. And that if you had it set up, for example, because you suggested it, one of the tools that we could use to fund childcare, you would be confronted by the possibility at some point in time that those revenues could fall way short, and all of a sudden then a social program is in jeopardy. You'd accept the fact that we're trying to actually remove reliance for social programs and maybe have the MLTT fund something that is a more variable, longer-term expenditure requirement, namely on the capital side?
I recall the many debates over this issue, and that former City Manager Wallace tried to, in fact, bake in certain amounts of money from the MLTT to bring stability to revenue for the city. I think our only point was that there are other tools available as well to help stabilize and diversify that revenue, and in fact, more so than in any other municipality in the province.
Yeah, it's not the time for me to get into a discussion with you about all the ones that I've been to pursue with the province that they so graciously gave us and then turned around to tell us that it wasn't really possible for us to implement them because they'd have to collect it and wouldn't, or various things like that. But anyway, I take your point. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, both.
Thank you.